a really integrated system. Lots happening in the endocrine system and kind of everywhere in the body, right? We've got a lot of things happening in the brain, a lot of different target organs like the thyroid gland, the pancreas, we've got the testes, ovaries. So there's a lot happening in the endocrine system. So our first objective here is to talk about the primary and secondary glands of the endocrine system, and also talk about some of the hormones that are associated with each of those. So when we talk about an endocrine gland, it's derived from epithelial tissue, meaning that it's lined with the epithelial cells of, let's say, the GI organ or other glandular tissue. So it's epithelial in its origin. There are two main types of endocrine organs. There are primary endocrine organs, meaning that hormone secretion and endocrine signaling are their main or primary function. Hypothalamus is an example of that. We're going to talk about some other examples. Secondary endocrine organs have hormone secretion as their secondary function. So they are performing another major role in the body, but they happen to also provide or produce some hormones. The heart is a really good example of that. So the heart, we know, has another major function with circulation and the oxygenation of tissues, but it also produces ANP, which is a hormone. And so we can think about the heart as being a secondary endocrine gland when compared to like the pituitary, the hypothalamus, that are primary endocrine glands. So here, let's look at some of the primary glands. We've got the hypothalamus and pituitary. These are the master endocrine glands. These are located in the brain, in the brainstem. We kind of pointed them out anatomically in the lab, so we should be familiar with the location of these structures. We've also got the pineal gland. This is another gland found in the brain, important with light and dark cycles. We'll talk about that. The thyroid and parathyroid glands are located in the neck region. They're going to be associated with calcium balance and thyroid hormone, which is important for metabolism. Then there's the thymus gland, really important in educating new T cells. It's really only functional in the first part of life. So up until puberty, thereabout, early adulthood, and then it, pretty much disappears because its job is over. It's anterior to the heart, so in the anterior thoracic region. Then there are the adrenal glands, paired glands. We talked about them a little bit as it pertains to the autonomic nervous system, interestingly, but we're going to talk about the outer part of the adrenal gland. So what we've been speaking about with the autonomic system is the inner medulla that has the chromaffin cells. The outer adrenal is the cortex of the adrenal gland. That's more involved in hormone production and the endocrine system. Then there's the pancreas. Really important, also a part of the GI system, but happens to be involved in hormone production. And then we've got the gonads, which their main role is hormone production and the reproductive function. That's going to be the testes in males and the ovaries in females. Let's look at some of the secondary endocrine glands. So again, glands are, organs that have other main function, but happen to also produce hormones that are involved in neuroendocrine signaling. So we've got the heart, which produces ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, really important in water balance, in osmolarity, in balancing that salt and water in our blood, in our plasma. Then we've got the kidneys. They secrete erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is the precursor hormone to brand new red blood cell production. So this is what gets us new erythrocyte, new red blood cell production, and this is produced by the kidneys. Then we've got the GI tract, several hormones associated here. There's CCK, secretin, and gastrin. These are important with absorption and digestion, important in bicarbonate release into the GI tract. Bicarbonate is important to neutralize the acidity of the stomach contents. We also have the regulation of bile production, all things that we'll talk about in the GI system in our next semester. Then there's the liver, secretes insulin-like growth factor, which is really important for growth, particularly of muscles and long bones. Then there is skin and the kidneys. Collectively, these two structures help with the production of vitamin D3 in its activated or hydroxylated form. So this is what turns vitamin D in our skin with the help of sunlight into the active form of vitamin D, which is 1,2,5-dihydroxy vitamin D3, otherwise known as cholecalciferol. And then the final secondary endocrine gland here is fat, right? Fat cells or adipose tissue produces leptin, which is important for our hunger and satiety signaling, which tells us when we're hungry versus when we're satiated or full. So all other, glands and organs that have other major roles, right? We know fat is really about metabolism and energy storage, but it also has that endocrine connection because of some of the hormones that it releases. Okay. Let's go on to objective 2 here, which is to talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary, both the anterior and posterior lobes of the pituitary. So the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, we said collectively, these two are the master endocrine glands. They pretty much give the instruction that tell all of the other glands that we talked about what to do. The hypothalamus specifically, we can think about the hypothalamus as the CEO of the entire thing, right? It's going to be sending its instruction to the pituitary, and then the pituitary will send those instructions out to all the glands that we just mentioned. So I think it's really helpful to think about hypothalamus, pituitary, and all the other glands in this kind of axis. We call this axis the hypothalamo-pituitary axis. So the hypothalamus anatomically located in the brain, the midbrain here. It's going to be just inferior to the thalamus. So here's thalamus for reference. Right below thalamus, we've got hypothalamus. And then the pituitary is going to be even more inferior to the hypothalamus. So here's the pituitary. We should know exactly where it sits, right in that sella turcica, that pituitary seat. And so this is the actual gland. It's got 2 lobes. It's got an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. There's also the infundibulum, and the infundibulum is the stalk connection between the hypothalamus up here and the pituitary down here, specifically the posterior pituitary, okay? So let's start by looking at the posterior pituitary and its connection to the hypothalamus. So the posterior pituitary releases what we call neurohormones. So they're really associated with neurons and not the epithelial tissue of our typical endocrine glands. And so basically we've got these neurosecretory cells that are residing in the hypothalamus. So in this image, this superior region is the hypothalamus. Down here is the pituitary, anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. This is the infundibulum, the stalk-like connection that bridges the gap between hypothalamus and posterior pituitary specifically. And so the somas, or the cell bodies of these neurosecretory hormones, reside up here in the hypothalamus, but then they extend their axons via the infundibulum all the way down to the capillary networks that are in the posterior pituitary. And so we can think about the 2 hormones that we're going to talk about now as being released from the posterior pituitary, but they're actually synthesized and created and made up here from these nuclei in the hypothalamus. Specifically, ADH, also called antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin, is released from the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, and it's released via the axonic connections that travel all the way down through the infundibulum down to the posterior pituitary. And this is how those hormones made in the hypothalamus can release into the blood down here in the pituitary. The second hormone, oxytocin, really made up here in the hypothalamus from the supraoptic nuclei. And then again, likewise, they're released down into the capillary networks in the posterior pituitary via the axonic projections that travel down via the infundibulum into the posterior pituitary. So it's a misnomer to say that the posterior pituitary secretes anything, right? It really only releases these hormones into the blood. These hormones are secreted up here in the hypothalamus. Let's look at the function of the 2 hormones. So ADH is important in water balance and osmolarity. It's also going to function the way that ANP did. I talked a little bit about ANP earlier from the heart. And so ADH and ANP are actually like antagonistic evil twin brothers, if you will. One is going to increase osmolarity, one is going to decrease osmolarity, but they both function in salt and water balance in the osmolarity of our plasma. Oxytocin, on the other hand, is synthesized in the supraoptic nuclei, and it's going to be important for milk ejection. And we want to distinguish or differentiate milk ejection from milk production. So oxytocin is important for milk letdown after birth, whereas prolactin, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, is important for the production or the synthesis of milk in the breast, in the glands of the breast. All right, let's talk about the anterior pituitary here. So the anterior pituitary is where we have the release of tropic hormones. And a tropic hormone is any hormone that is going to regulate the secretion of another hormone or another gland that's secreting another hormone. This can be a stimulatory effect on that other hormone, or it can be an inhibitory effect on that other hormone. And so these tropic hormones are secreted from the anterior pituitary. They enter the blood here via a portal system. I'll explain what I mean by a portal system in a bit. But then from the blood, they can travel out to all the other glands we talked about: thyroid, parathyroids, pancreas, etc. And they can influence those glands to either stimulate a hormone production or to inhibit their hormone production as a consequence. Let's talk about the portal system. So the portal system, and just generally speaking, a portal system is any time we see blood going from the heart to a capillary bed and not going back to the heart, but going to a second capillary bed instead. So it's where we have two capillary connections in series without going back to the heart first, okay? This is where we have deoxygenated blood essentially going from one capillary network to another capillary network. And we can see that illustrated here. So we've got fresh oxygenated blood coming to the hypothalamus. Instead of going back to the heart the way most of our other circulatory systems do, it's going to go from this capillary bed, and it's shown here in purple to illustrate the fact that it's slightly deoxygenated at this point. And then from here, it goes to another capillary bed, which is in the anterior pituitary, and then it goes back to the heart via the veins, okay? So two capillary systems in series is what we call a portal system. And the reason that the portal system is so important here at the hypothalamo pituitary axis is because the hormones that are released into this capillary network from the hypothalamus can use this portal vein and make their way to the anterior pituitary, and they can then influence the anterior pituitary to secrete these trophic hormones that I talked about earlier. And these trophic hormones will enter the blood and go out to their respective organs: thyroid, testes, etc. Okay, so the portal system is crucial in getting the hormones that are made up here in the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus, getting those trophic hormones to then go down to the pituitary, influence the pituitary to secrete a second set of trophic hormones that can then go out to all of those target endocrine organs. Okay, so let's kind of explain this a little bit further on this slide here. So blood from the trophic hormones, right? Blood with the trophic hormones will then enter the portal vein. So here's that portal vein. And remember, in this system, in this vessel, in this portal vein, we've got some of these hormones that were secreted here from the hypothalamus. Instead of going back to the heart, they can just hitch a ride on this portal system and make their way down here into the anterior pituitary. We can see them here. They are represented by these blue dots. From here, these hormones will then influence these cells, right? The epithelial endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary. We can see these blue dots making their way into these cells, influencing these cells to secrete other hormones into the blood. And then these other hormones, which are indicated here by the red dots, can make their way out to the peripheral tissues. And they're also trophic hormones as well. So they're going to have a similar effect in that they're going to influence the other organs to stimulate or inhibit their hormone secretion. All right. I'm going to pause here briefly and see what questions we've got. And then we're going to illustrate the hypothalamo-pituitary axis here. So let's look at all the trophic hormones and endocrine hormones and glands that are associated in the hypothalamo-pituitary axis. So a couple of things here. Let's look at the location here. And then we'll talk about the 3 different divisions, so to speak. All right. So first off, we've got the hypothalamus over here. Oops. We've got the anterior pituitary. And then we've got the endocrine glands themselves. And when we say endocrine glands, we can call the peripheral endocrine glands, because the hypothalamus and pituitary are also endocrine glands. So let's talk about the hormones up at the top here. So we've got prolactin. And I'm going to abbreviate releasing hormone with RH. So prolactin releasing hormone. There's also prolactin inhibitory hormone, which I'll abbreviate with IH. Okay, remember we said that tropic hormones can either be stimulatory, in other words, they're going to encourage that other gland to release, so that's where we get that releasing hormone from, or they can be inhibitory, which is where we get that IH inhibitory from. Then there's also thyroid releasing hormone and thyroid inhibitory hormone. So thyroid releasing hormone, so there's no thyroid inhibitor, so thyroid releasing hormone only, cortisol releasing hormone. And I'll talk about how the negative feedback can play into decreasing thyroid production and kind of take the place of inhibitory hormone. And then there's GnRH and GHIH. So GHRH. This is actually growth hormone releasing hormone. I'll write that here for short. And growth hormone inhibitory hormone. Okay, so growth hormone releasing hormone, growth hormone inhibitory hormone, and then the final hormone is GnRH, which is really standing for gonadotropin, really long word, gonadotropin releasing hormone. So let's look at some of the effects here, and I'll draw these arrows in green to show when they are stimulating. So this is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to produce prolactin. So this is being produced from the anterior pituitary. And let's remind ourselves that the portal circulation is what's used to bring about this communication. So this is used, this communication is being brought about by the portal circulation. This is how these hormones get from the hypothalamus into the pituitary. Then we've got the prolactin inhibitory hormone actually inhibiting prolactin secretion. Let's use another arrow, or another color rather. So this is going to inhibit prolactin secretion. We've got thyroid releasing hormone that is going to stimulate TSH production from the anterior pituitary. So again, I'm going to put a plus arrow and I'm going to put TSH. Then we've got cortisol, which stimulates cortisol releasing hormone, which stimulates ACTH from the adrenal cortex. Again, a plus sign here. This is the trophic hormone that's released, ACTH. Then we've got, likewise, GHRH and GHIH, both acting on growth hormone release from the anterior pituitary. GHRH is going to stimulate growth hormone production. Whereas, let's write growth hormone here. Whereas GHIH, or growth hormone inhibiting hormone, is going to decrease growth hormone production, okay? And then the final trophic hormone from the hypothalamus here is GnRH, so gonadotropin releasing hormone. That is going to stimulate the production of two hormones, FSH and LH, from the anterior pituitary. FSH and LH, okay? And we'll talk about what they do in turn. Okay, let's talk about the tertiary endocrine glands that are affected by each of these hormones. So prolactin is going to act on the breast. It's going to be responsible for milk production. Remember, oxytocin is milk letdown or ejection. Prolactin is milk production. And we can either be stimulating that or inhibiting that, depending on which releasing hormone is being released from the hypothalamus. We've got thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, that is going to stimulate the thyroid gland. And that's going to allow the thyroid gland to produce T3 and T4. So T3, T4 production. I should have probably wrote this down here. So this should have been milk production down here. Okay. Then we've got cortisol releasing hormone stimulating ACTH. ACTH acts on the adrenal cortex, right? So remember, not the inner part of the medulla where we've got those chromaffin cells, but the outer, lighter staining region, which is the cortex, or the cortical region. So adrenal cortex. That is going to be important for cortisol production, cortisol being our major stress hormone. We'll talk about what its function is, right? So cortisol production. Okay, then we've got growth hormone, can either be stimulated or inhibited from those trophic hormones. And then growth hormone in and of itself is going to increase liver and blood cell growth, right? So it's going to act on liver cells as well as our other body cells. Not blood, did I say blood? I'm sorry, body cells. So other cells of the body. So muscle cells, bone cells, etc. And those are going to increase their insulin-like growth factor, which is what allows them to increase growth. So insulin-like growth factor. Let me actually write some of those examples here. So we've got body cells, bone, muscle. Okay. And then the final axis here is going to be FSH and LH. These are going to act on the gonads, which are going to be different for males and females. So we've got the testes and ovaries. Testes, we know, produce androgens. I apologize, the space is getting really small here. And then ovaries, we know, produce estrogen and progesterone. Let's make this a little bit longer here. So estrogen and progesterone. Okay. And so this is kind of the axis between our hypothalamus and those initial trophic hormones that can either be inhibitory or stimulatory releasing. Then we've got the connection to via the portal circulation to the anterior pituitary that can have an effect on these hormones, so prolactin, TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, ACTH, which is adrenal cortical trophic hormone, growth hormone, and then FSH and LH. FSH being follicular stimulating hormone, LH being luteinizing hormone, okay? And to save space, I kind of wrote these in shorthand. Then we've got from that connection, let's make a note here. This is via the systemic circulation now. So this communication happens via the systemic circulation. And then these anterior pituitary hormones will then have their effect on these endocrine glands. So the breast causing milk production, the thyroid gland causing T3, T4 production, the adrenal cortex, so the outer adrenal gland causing cortisol production, liver cells and our bone cells, muscle cells causing growth, right? The secretion of IGF. And then gonads, testes and ovaries producing our androgens and estrogen and progesterone in males and females respectively.